This is what I need. Good morning. A few announcements before we get started. First, if you're using a T-cell apparatus this morning, it's time to turn it on. Secondly, if you haven't yet turned your phone off and stowed it, stow is a great word. It's like on the airlines. If you will turn off your phone and stow it before takeoff, that will be great. And third, we are delighted this morning to welcome back Joanne Bungie. Joanne, as you know, was the driving force behind the bucket course, and we're delighted to see you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Good. Excellent. Well, this morning we are pleased to welcome Peter Hanson, Associate Professor of Political Science at the college. And you can see the title of his talk right here. It's going to be really interesting. Grinnell College and a national poll, so that's exciting news. I asked Peter to tell me a couple of things that I might not otherwise know about him. Fortunately, these are not intimate details of his life. I'm able to share them with you. You may or may not know that Peter worked in the U.S. Senate for Senator Tom Daschle for a number of years, and coming out of that experience, he wrote a book about the Senate budget process, and you might understand by the title, Too Weak to Govern, that maybe the Senate budgeting process isn't going all that well. Peter came here to the college 2 years ago, and is going to talk to us this morning about the national poll and the midterm elections. Peter, we're delighted to have you here. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to do a quick mic check here. Can you hear me in back? Great, okay. Well, I'm really pleased to be here this morning. Thanks for this invitation, and I'm especially pleased to have a chance to talk about the new Grinnell College National Poll. This is a new project of ours. It's a pilot project. President Kington authorized 2 national polls, one prior to the election and one after the election. And our goal here is to see whether we can meet a set of goals for the college. One is that we wanted to see if we could use this poll as a teaching resource. So get data fresh from the field into the classroom and a chance for our students to analyze that on their own and learn about politics firsthand. They're also going to have a chance to design the questionnaire for the survey. So we just had a group of students yesterday designing the questionnaire for the post-election poll. We're hoping that this will be a resource for faculty research. And so if you ever have a chance to look at the questionnaire for the first poll, you'll see we have batteries of questions on immigration and political activism. I'll talk about those today. Those came out of ideas proposed by our faculty. So Danielle Lucier and Xavier Escandel were both people who advocated for those question batteries and will be using those in their research. And then finally, we're hoping that this poll can be a way that the college can improve its national visibility. We have tremendous expertise at the college. We want to give our faculty the chance to perhaps talk to the national media, write think pieces, and help the public understand some of the major issues of our day. And so we're in the middle of assessing to see whether we can meet those goals. If we feel confident about them, I think we'll continue to do this, but we'll know more in the months ahead. So today I'll be talking about what we learned. That's not working. Let's try this. All right, so there's one request to turn out the lights. And I think someone's having trouble hearing me.
Yeah, we need to turn the mic around.
Okay.
Oops.
All right, everyone, is that better? Okay, good. I was joking with Janet that I feel like Taylor Swift with this on. I don't know if I look like her too. I hope the facial hair might throw that off. Okay, so I hope you can all hear me better now. So one of my goals today is, I really have two goals today. The first is to tell you some of the basic findings of political science about midterm elections. I want to set the context for you for these elections so you can know how a political scientist might think about them. What do we know about the electorate, for example? How persuadable are people? And then second, with that context in mind, what have we learned from the Grinnell College National Poll? Can we use it to make any predictions about what might happen in these midterm elections? So I think the basic setting is probably well known to most of you. Republicans control the presidency and Congress right now. In order for that to change, Democrats would have to win 24 seats in the House of Representatives and 2 seats in the Senate. Now, it might seem like the Senate would be more likely to flip. That's not the case. And that's not the case because most of the seats up this cycle in the Senate are held by Democrats, and most of those Democrats come from states that voted for President Trump. So the real question there is whether those Democrats can hold on to those seats. In some cases, it seems that they probably will not. For example, Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota is facing a very tough race. So the outlook of the Senate is probably one of no change. But the House is a different matter. The House, I think most people think, is likely to flip. Democrats are likely to take control of it. I'll tell you what our poll says about that. But the House has its own challenges. It's actually quite hard for Democrats to take control of the House, and I'll explain why that is. So what do we know as we head into this pivotal election? What do we know about the landscape? So I'm going to focus on a few major issues today. The first is that in today's politics, mobilization matters more than persuasion. We just don't have that many persuadable voters in the electorate anymore. I think for years we've heard about the need to win the middle. The middle has grown ever smaller. And if you look at the strategies being adopted by political candidates today, they're really strategies of mobilization. What is a Trump rally? Except for mobilization strategies, not an attempt at persuasion as much as it is at rallying the faithful. And we see that kind of strategy is one I'll talk about and why it makes political sense today. The basic reasons why voters are not persuadable as much as they used to be is that they have sorted out along 2 different lines. The first is along ideological lines. We've witnessed a process that I call ideological sorting in the electorate. That's been happening for decades. It's not something new. It started back in the 1950s and 60s, and we're seeing its culmination today. The second is a process of geographical sorting. And what I mean by that is that voters have sorted themselves out by where they live. Not necessarily intentionally, but Democrats and Republicans tend to be geographically clustered together. So people are often surrounded by like-minded people. Now, within this context, within the context of an electorate where there's not a lot of persuasion happening, we do see 2 interesting trends that I'll focus on today. The first is the emergence of immigration as a defining issue. This wouldn't have been true, say, 20 years ago. Immigration is now a powerful predictor of voting intentions. More so, I'll show you the data in a little bit. It's a better predictor than someone's level of education, at least in our polling data. And then second, we've been seeing a lot of media coverage of political mobilization by women. And so I thought it'd be interesting in this talk to focus on these 2 issues. What is the effect of immigration in the 2018 midterm elections, and what evidence does our poll provide us about the impact of political mobilization by women? So I'll talk about those 2 things specifically. So let me start out talking about why I argue that mobilization has become more important than persuasion. And what I mean by that is we sort of think of politicians going out to the public and making their case and arguing for a set of issues. You know, I want to persuade you that my position on a particular issue is the correct position. Now, that's in contrast to mobilization, where there's a premise that we already agree, and what I'm really trying to do is to get you to show up at the polls. And I think what we're seeing more of is that second issue. Well, let me just provide a little bit of evidence about that, and why I say that there's very little persuasion happening today. Now this graph, I copied it from a book, so it's a little hard to read. I'll explain to you what it says. Basically, this dark line, this starts in the 1950s, goes to the 1960s, 70s, 80s, up through 2012 to 2014. This is the percentage of Democrats and Republicans running for the House that win in districts dominated by the other party. So if you're a Democrat, can you go win a district controlled by, or where that is a majority Republican district? So in the 1950s, 25% of Democrats were coming out of Republican-dominated districts. It went up to as high as 44% in the 1970s. Republicans weren't doing quite as well, but we had 15% of Republicans winning Democratic districts in the 60s, 12% of Republicans winning Democratic districts in the 70s. That's almost disappeared. Right. So now, the way a congressional district votes for president is almost perfectly correlated with how it votes for the House of Representatives. There's just not a lot of crossover districts anymore where a Republican district might elect a Democratic representative or the other way around. One of the reasons for that is that voters have sorted themselves out into two ideological camps. Now, what you're seeing here is, and I'll explain this is a little confusing to look at. The dark lines represent Democratic voters. The white lines represent Republican voters. This is a histogram. This shows the distribution of voters across an ideological scale. This ideological scale runs from liberal on the left to conservative on the right. And all I really want you to see here is there's a nice bell curve of Democrats on the left and a nice bell curve of Republicans on the right, and there's some overlap there in the middle. But that's new, right? The fact that voters have divided in that way, that we see two clear ideological camps among voters, is really something that we wouldn't have seen back in the 1950s and 60s. We wouldn't have seen that in Congress distinctly in the 1950s and 60s. So we have a sort of new situation where people who are politically liberal have now affiliated with the Democratic Party, and people who are politically conservative have affiliated with Republicans. Now that's not a perfect matchup, but that's much truer today than it was in the past. That's reflected in Congress. So this is a similar graph showing the ideological distribution of senators. And so this blue curve shows the ideological distribution of Democratic senators in the 50s. And on this particular scale, -1 means most liberal, 1 means most conservative, and 0 means moderate. So notice we had a lot of Democrats kind of scooting over to the conservative side of the spectrum. We had a lot of Republicans scooting over to the left side of the spectrum, and a lot of overlap between them. Notice how that has almost totally disappeared then by 2011, 2012. Both parties have scooted out toward the extreme. That curve is much steeper. That means each party is much more homogeneous, and there's really no overlap between them. So we haven't been in a political situation like this since the late 1800s. You would have to go back over 100 years to find our politics as polarized as they are today. So what's happened? The pattern we're seeing is what political scientists call ideological sorting. And I've tried to illustrate it here with some simple graphs, but essentially you can think of the parties in the 50s and 60s as being ideological hodgepodges. Democrats had a lot of liberals and conservatives. Republicans had a lot of liberals and conservatives. Your ideological self-identification just didn't match up with your party. You could fall anywhere on that ideological spectrum and feel comfortable in either party. Now, today voters have really sorted themselves out. Today's parties are ideologically homogeneous. Not perfectly, but much more so relative to the past. So that by current times, if you are liberal, you're almost certainly a Democrat. If you're conservative, you are almost certainly a Republican. So we've got very ideologically pure parties now participating in nominating contests like primaries and caucuses and electing candidates. So why has that happened? Well, we really have to go back to the 60s to understand that. This process has been going on for decades. And the easiest way to explain why is just to tell the story of the American South. In the wake of the Civil War, you recall Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Right? And so Republicans in the Civil War used the power of government to reshape the South. First by defeating them in battle, and then second by sending Union troops to occupy the South and using federal power to reshape the South's social structure so that during Reconstruction, African Americans who had been newly freed from slavery were voting, were electing officials, were being given social power that they'd never had before. Well, one of the reactions from that time in the South was to become deeply hostile to the Republican Party. You have to put yourself back in the history of the time. Our parties looked totally different then. The Republican Party in the 1860s, really through the end of the 1800s, was the party of big government. It was the party of civil rights. It was the anti-slavery party. This was the party that wanted to use the power of government to reshape society. Democrats were generally sympathetic with slavery. In the North, they had been sympathetic with the aims of the South, generally hostile to the war. And after the Civil War, Democrats have been hostile to the extension of civil rights to African Americans. And so the South became closely associated with the Democratic Party. And when the Union occupation finally ended, those troops were pulled out. There was no more an opportunity to use the power of the Army to protect black voters or to protect Republican Party institutions in the South. They were systematically destroyed, oftentimes through violent means. So entities like the KKK would have suppressed black voters. Violence would have been used to intimidate people from going to the polls. Violence would have been used to assassinate political officials. And the Republican Party really ceased to exist as a political organization in the South. It became totally dominated by Democrats. So if you would have thought about the political identity of the Democratic Party at the turn of the 20th century, it was one that was very conservative, very hostile to civil rights, and very hostile to the power of big government. Now that starts to change very shortly thereafter. And what happens is two Democratic parties start to develop, the party of FDR and the party of the South. So over the course of about 40 years, the northern wing of the Democratic Party becomes the party you see today, right? A party of unions, a party based in the working class, a party that welcomed outsiders. It had a lot of immigrants who were Democrats in the North. But also, blacks fleeing oppression in the South moved north, often moved to cities, and were absorbed into Democratic constituencies in the North. And so Northern Democrats had to start being responsive to black voters. And as a result, they became sympathetic to civil rights. And we started to see people like Hubert Humphrey emerging, right? A Minnesota champion of civil rights, Northern Democrat. And so really over the course then of the 1960s, this split really comes to a head. We've got two Democratic parties really diametrically opposed to each other. We've got that southern version of the Democratic Party still the same as it had been since the end of the Civil War. Deeply conservative, deeply hostile to civil rights, dominated by segregationists. And we had a northern wing of the party that had become progressive on civil rights, progressive on economic legislation, progressive on, or embracing strong federal power. Well, that's the reason why we had an ideological hodgepodge in the parties. Republicans went through their own sort of split personality like that. The northern wing of the Republican Party, or New England Republicans, tended to be pretty moderate. Those out in the West, much more conservative, had embraced grazing and mining interests. And so the parties were really this ideological mix. Well, the dam breaks then in the 1960s. And one of the reasons it breaks is because of civil rights. So you'll remember that Lyndon Johnson championed civil rights legislation once he was president and helped to push it through Congress. Well, when he succeeded in doing that, one of the things he said is that we've destroyed the Democratic Party in the South for a generation. He knew that Southern Democrats would view his embracing of civil rights as a betrayal. Right? And that's really what happened. The Democratic Party in the South at that point lost its moorings. It had been a segregationist party in a region where segregation had just been dismantled. And the party fell apart. What remained of the Democratic Party was its northern wing. That's what we see today. And what happened in the South was a slow process by which conservatives found their way to the Republican Party. Now, there are other trends nationwide that help to drive this sorting, but that in a sort of encapsulated fashion is why the parties sorted themselves out ideologically. You can think about this happening, for example, in the 1968 Democratic Convention. Do you remember students marching on Humphrey in the Chicago Convention Hall and the Chicago police being unleashed and just beating the living daylights out of these students in the street of Chicago? That was the Democratic Party breaking into. Right? The old conservative wing dying, ironically embodied by Humphrey, I think because he supported the war. You know, Humphrey, of course, was a progressive, but his support for the war, I think, really discredited him in the eyes of the younger generation of Democrats. But that's a story of the parties becoming homogenous, and it's something. Again, it reflects an enormous societal change. It's not something we fix, right? It's not like you can go back and just make the parties ideological hodgepodges again. This was a huge societal transformation. Moreover, I think one of the things people think of, well, we want the parties to be less polarized. Let's go back to the way things used to be. But we would never want to go back there. I've just explained the whole basis of why parties were ideologically mixed up. We would never want to go back to that. So the question is, how do we move forward? There's not an easy answer here. Because we're seeing society itself changing. Okay, so that's one part of the story. We've seen the parties become ideologically more homogenous as a result of major societal changes. There's another trend that's going on here, and that's geographical sorting. And I want to illustrate it by showing you a map of Florida. This is a three-dimensional map. The taller it gets, the more people are concentrated together. Blue indicates concentrations of Democratic voters, red equals concentrations of Republican voters. Now, the pattern I want to show to you is that it is the Democratic areas where you see the graph peaking, right? That's where, you notice along the coastal areas, you see big blue spikes. Those are cities, concentrations of people. That's why the graph is spiking, because it's a three-dimensional graph showing density of people. And the clear pattern you see is that Democrats tend to be highly concentrated together. Cities tend to be overwhelmingly Democratic. The countryside tends to be Republican, but much more thinly populated. And if you would look at the numbers, you would find that in these Democratic areas, the ratio between Democrats and Republicans is really skewed. It might be 80% Democratic, 20% Republican. In the countryside, it's much less skewed. It might be, say, 60% Republican, 40% Democratic, so it's a lot more even. So we're seeing a bunching together of people, a sort of sorting out on geographical lines. Now, what consequence does this have? Well, this really matters when we draw congressional districts. Because if your congressional districts just follow natural boundaries, and set aside gerrymandering, if your congressional districts just follow natural boundaries, then they will be politically skewed one way or the other. So I used to live in Denver. If you draw a perfectly normal congressional district around the city of Denver, it's 80% Democratic. You don't have to gerrymander whatsoever to get that outcome. The result is that our congressional districts tend to be politically lopsided. So this is a chart showing Colorado congressional districts. Each dot is a district, along the bottom, we see the proportion of voters in that district that supported Barack Obama. We got districts 1 through 7. Now, I lived in District 1, Denver, far, far over on the Democratic side. If you look at District 5, this is Colorado Springs. It's the home of Focus on the Family and military bases. It's a very, very conservative town, right? It only voted 40% for Barack Obama. And then we've got some that are a little closer in the middle, but none that actually match Colorado as a whole, which is that red line, the average vote in Colorado. So there's a lot of political variation here. Congressional districts are very different from one another. Well, what are some of the consequences of this? Well, first I just want to kind of explain why that is. How have we gotten into this situation? Well, there's a wonderful book called The Big Sort. It's by a journalist named Bill Bishop. And political scientists got mad that a journalist wrote an insightful book, so they attacked Bishop. But I actually think Bishop's got a lot of really good insights here, so I'm going to stand up for him. What he did is he looked at counties. And what's interesting about counties is their boundaries are fixed. They don't change over time. And so he watched the political voting patterns of counties over time. And what he found was that we started to see a lot more counties that were politically lopsided, voting heavily for Democrats or heavily for Republicans. And one of the conclusions he drew from this is that Americans move around a lot. When we move, we tend to move to areas that either purposefully or more likely just accidentally are politically like-minded for us. We move to places where we feel we fit in, right? And it so happens that places where we feel we fit in are probably filled with people who have similar political beliefs to us. And so just through the natural force of Americans moving around, they have sorted and choosing where they want to live, they have self-sorted into politically like-minded communities with the result of creating patterns like the one I showed you in Florida, where Democrats end up in cities and urban areas where Republicans are more likely to be in the countryside. And the result of that is we tend to get these very lopsided political districts. Few in the middle, many more in the extremes. But what does that mean? One of the things it means is there are very few competitive congressional districts. This is a map of all the congressional districts, and I've sorted them out by how they voted for Barack Obama. So this is percentage of the vote Obama received in that district. And I've defined safely Republican as any district where Obama won less than 45%, and safely Democratic as any district that Obama won by more than 55%. Well, that's most of the districts. It is very, very hard for the opposing party to win a district in these regions, which means that the actual competitive districts are very few in number. They're right there in the middle. And there's just not that many of them. And it's not because of gerrymandering. I mean, that certainly contributes to it. A lot of the reason is just our political geography, how we have sorted ourselves out as a people. So, we have all this attention now on whether Democrats will retake the House. A lot of that is boiling down to parties just fighting for ground in this very small number of competitive districts. Okay, so that's the major groundwork here. I've just argued that we have an electorate where mobilization matters more than persuasion. I've explained how the parties have sorted themselves out ideologically and why there are very, very few actually competitive congressional districts. But I'd like to talk just a little bit about the issues and what major issues we're seeing in the 2018 election. I want to start by talking about what I think is perhaps the most important underlying issue of our politics, and that is demographic change. This is the pattern of immigration to the United States over the last 150 years or so. I guess it goes back to 1900. In 1900, we were in the middle of a massive wave of immigration. That immigration was almost entirely coming from Europe. And Then, in the 1920s, there was a backlash. In the wake of World War I, the United States went through a wave of nativism. There was a push for English-only laws. There was a sense that there were too many immigrants in the United States. We needed to shut our doors, and that's what happened. Congress passed legislation changing immigration laws that made it almost impossible to immigrate to the United States. You can see levels of immigration dropped rapidly, reaching their nadir in about the 1960s. And that's when Congress changed the law again. Under Lyndon Johnson, Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. And this act reopened our doors to immigration, but it opened them to the world. So prior to this, in the previous wave of immigration, the source nations had largely been in Europe. After 1965, we started to see immigrants coming from Latin America, from Asia, much more so than Europe. And we're now in the middle of that second immigration boom. And we're seeing just what we saw in the 1920s. We're starting to see a backlash against it. People saying there are too many immigrants. Immigrants are changing the character of the United States, exactly in the same sort of way that was said in the 1920s. What's different about today, though, is that this immigration is bringing with it a demographic change because the source nations for immigration are different than those in the 1900s. We've got people coming from Asia and Latin America, and that's changing the demographic profile of the United States. One of the consequences is that by 2050, the United States will no longer have a white majority. So you can see, this is the United States in 2010, this is census data. 65% of Americans identify themselves as white. Fast forward to 2050, that percentage will decline to 46%. The nation will be about 30% Latino, 12% Black, about 8% Asian. So we're heading toward a demographic situation where there will be no single majority group in the United States. And I think the tension that's arising out of this is really transforming our politics. I think it's shaping, it's creating an intensity to anti-immigration sentiment, the likes of which we really haven't seen for decades. So I want to talk about some of the ways this is reshaping our politics. I think we saw the first sign of it in California in the 1990s. So California has always been on the cutting edge of immigration transformation. I mean, California's demographics started changing much earlier than the rest of the country. California is already a state where there was no single majority group. And California was reaching that point of transformation in the 1990s, and there was a tremendous backlash against immigration at that time. One sign of that backlash was that voters adopted something called Prop 187. And Prop 187 would have denied all non-emergency social services to undocumented immigrants. Now, California's governor at the time, Pete Wilson, rode that proposition to victory. Let me show you an ad that he ran during that time. Now, when I tested this, it crashed the computer, so we'll see if it does that again.
They keep coming. 2 million illegal immigrants in California. The federal government won't stop them at the border, yet requires us to pay billions to take care of them. Governor Pete Wilson sent the National Guard to help the Border Patrol. But that's not all.
For California to work hard, pay taxes, and obey the laws, I'm suing to force the federal government to control the border. And I'm working to deny state services to illegal immigrants. Enough is enough.
Governor Pete Wilson.
Okay. So, Wilson won re-election, in part by backing Prop 187, riding this wave of anti-immigrant sentiment to a second term as governor. Well, what happened? I mean, I sort of think California's a test case. You know, is the United States going to follow the path of California, or are we following a different path? Well, the California example demonstrated that Wilson won a short-term victory for a long-term defeat. As a result of the passage of Prop 187 in California, Latino voters turned overwhelmingly Democratic. They concluded that the Republican Party was essentially hostile, and liberal white voters in California continued to vote Democratic, and as a result of that coalition, the Democratic Party in California became the dominant political force in the state. Now that's in the state that gave us Ronald Reagan. California used to be a pretty solidly Republican state. And so political scientists who have looked at the California example have concluded that one consequence of this anti-immigration backlash in California was really to push the state solidly into the Democratic Party. So some people have said, well, that same thing's going to happen nationwide, right? The nation's transforming demographically, like numbers matter, right? The number, so as the sons and daughters of today's immigrants become voters, we're going to see the country shift decisively against the kind of really heated rhetoric that we're seeing today against immigrants. Well, it's not such an easy story. And the reason is that demographic change is not proceeding equally across the country. Northern states, up in the Rust Belt, for example, states that flipped to vote Republican in the last election, they've been historically Democratic, but states like Michigan and Wisconsin voted Republican in the last election. They're transforming very slowly. They're going to remain majority white states for a very long time. The rest of the country, the southern part of the country, tends to be changing much more quickly. That means we're not going to see a sort of single sweeping transformation politically like we did in California. It's much more likely that our electoral politics are going to remain complicated. We're going to see individual states moving in different directions, probably the Rust Belt becoming more solidly Republican, and southern states like Georgia and Arizona starting to move more in the Democratic direction. But there's not an easy story here about the nation changing in the same way that California did. So that's one example. We've got demographic change really reshaping the nation's politics, becoming a major issue in the midterm elections. Second, we also have the political mobilization of women, and we just saw a demonstration of that at the confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh. Now, this is something that I've been very curious about. I wanted to learn more about how extensive this mobilization is and how consequential it will be. One of the questions we have, of course, is when election day comes, will women show up in disproportionate numbers? Will the political concerns of women reshape the political agenda? We don't know all the answers to this. We're still seeing this play out in real time, but it's something I want to spend some time talking about today. What we do know is that there is a substantial difference in the two parties by gender. And the Republican Party today, you can see, this is the Republican column, is only a little over 40% women. And the Democratic Party today is much closer to 60%. So women today are much more likely to identify as Democrats than Republicans. So in addition to any sort of differences we might see in politics by gender, we already know that we're seeing those differences appear in our political parties, that the Democrats have embraced an identity as the party of women. And that's going to actually make our analytical job difficult. Because if women are also likely to be Democrats, one of the questions we have to ask is, are we seeing a partisan mobilization? Are we seeing Democrats mobilize, and we're seeing a lot of women mobilize because many women are Democrats? Or is there a broader mobilization of women as a whole, regardless of party? All right, so that's really setting the stage, and Janet's giving me the signal that it's time for a break. So what I'll do when we return is start to walk through the data from the Grinnell College National Poll.
Great, we're going to take 10 minutes.
All right, everyone. So I was asked to move the mic a bit closer to my face, so I'm going to try and amplify myself as much as possible without blasting you out of the room. Okay, so we finished talking about elections being more about mobilization and persuasion. So I just wanted to sort of set the stage with this slide and talk about where we're moving forward. One of the takeaways here is it's very, very hard for Democrats to win the House. And one of the reasons is that Democratic voters are not distributed well. So I gave you the example of Democrats being concentrated in urban areas. The city of Denver, 80% Democratic. Well, that's actually a lot of wasted Democratic votes. You don't need to win an election by 80%. You need to win it by 51. So, you know, if you were running the Democratic Party, you want to take those voters and sprinkle them out into other districts. Well, one of the consequences about that is if you look at what's called the popular vote for the House of Representatives, and this is just if you take every vote that's cast in a House race and you pool them together and you see who wins, Democrats have to win that popular vote by somewhere between 5 to 7% to win a majority in the House. Because so many of their votes are wasted in districts where they're winning by these huge lopsided margins. So you might ask, well, what did we find for the popular vote for Democrats? That's coming up, but I'll give you a preview of the answer. Our number was 2. So we saw a very small Democratic edge. If our findings right, then Republicans will hold the House. Now we've got some other data too that I'll show you that suggests it's more competitive than I'm suggesting now. One of the main questions we're going to have to ask then, right, so we know it's going to be hard to take the House, we know mobilization matters. One of the first questions we have then is who's going to show up on election day? Now, historically we know a couple of things. We know that Democrats are less likely to vote than Republicans, and that has to do with the socioeconomic characteristics of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is more likely to be poor, more likely to be, or voters are more likely to be less educated, 2 factors that are associated with lower turnout. We also know there's a countervailing influence here, which is that the party of the president almost always loses seats in midterm elections. So, on the one hand, we know Democratic turnout tends to be low. On the other hand, we know the president's party tends to lose seats. We also have this question of the extent that women are mobilized. Women are disproportionately Democrats. And finally, we know that the president is attempting to harness this anti-immigration backlash. How far can that take him? So let's explore all of these things. Let's turn to the findings of the Grinnell College National Poll. First, who will vote? Well, the first thing we see is that, as is true in almost every election, Democrats on average are less likely to turn out than Republicans. So we ask the question, are you definitely going to vote on election day? Are you probably going to vote? You might or might not, or you're probably not going to vote. And this is the response of people who said definitely, percentage of within each party that said they would definitely vote. And you can see that Republicans had a 16-point advantage here in terms of who will turn out. Now, the thing to recognize is that there are more Democrats than Republicans in the country. So even a lower turnout among Democrats could still be a sizable chunk of the electorate. But just as a starting point, recognize that this turnout differential exists. So what does the likely electorate look like? This is the composition of our poll of people who said they would definitely vote. And that electorate, those are the people who really show up on election day, is 40% Democratic, 40% Republican, and 20% independent. And you can reach that balance again because there are more Democrats than Republicans in the electorate. So a very balanced electorate. Now, scoot over and look at people who say they will probably vote. This is really interesting, right? So if you're a party strategist and one of your tasks is, we need to mobilize our voters, you ask yourself the question, well, how many voters are out there to be mobilized? In this probably column, we see there are a lot of Democratic voters left to be mobilized. right? Not as many Republican voters. It means the strategic dilemma for the two parties is very different. If you are a Republican strategist, your goal right now is to make sure your voters show up. Right? They've been mobilized, you got to keep them mobilized, you got to make sure they show up on election day. If you are a Democratic strategist, you've got to get those probably voters to the polls. Not only have to make sure these folks do show up, but you've got a huge pool here that could be mobilized and could make a difference if they show up on election day. Okay, so it's always really hard to project who is actually going to turn out on election day. We ask people, are you going to show up and vote? They say, yes, I'm going to. I also know that those figures I just showed you are high. They're almost certainly going to be lower than what people tell us when we ask them in a poll. So we tried to think of a different way of understanding the degree to which Democrats and Republicans are mobilized in the electorate. So what we did is we asked a battery of questions, and we said to our respondents, have you done any of the following political activities in the last few years? And we asked about whether they'd attended a meeting or a protest, or given money, or contacted an elected official, or helped someone register. And what we found in this case was that Democrats are far more mobilized than Republicans. So you can see across the board here, this is past activity. In terms of who's attended a meeting, substantial Democratic advantage. Democrats were much more likely to attend a meeting. Democrats were more likely to give money. Democrats were more likely to have contacted an elected official. They were more likely to have helped someone register to vote. And those differences continued in activity expected for the future. So I was talking about this with Ann Seltzer, who is our pollster, and we both agreed that if you have to ask this question, all right, people say they're going to vote, are they really going to vote? Right? Well, this evidence suggested to us that Democratic enthusiasm has some durability to it. Right? The Democratic voters are heading into the electorate quite engaged, and that suggests their turnout numbers will probably be good. But we just don't know, right? And of course, what do you see happening right now? We're seeing both parties making a serious effort to mobilize their voters. I think the Kavanaugh nomination has turned into an effort to mobilize Republican voters. You see the president talking about it at his rallies. So we'll see how this plays out. Our poll was in the field over Labor Day, right? So these data are already a few weeks old. How is the president affecting the electorate? All right, it will not surprise you to learn that approval for the president is almost perfectly polarized by party. Republicans, vast majority approve of the president. Democrats, a vast majority disapprove of the president. Among independents, the balance, the plurality is disapproval. Most independents, or plurality of independents, disapprove of the president. If you think about, political warning signs, if I were the president's strategist, I would look at those numbers among independents and see problems. That's a number that they would want to change. So we know that we're starting to see, well, I'll make the case here. The case I'm going to make here is that these strong feelings about the president are really shaping people's approach to this election overall and driving voting decisions. So here's what our likely electorate looks like by whether or not people approve of the president. Here's the people who say they will definitely vote, and 54% of the likely electorate disapproves of the president. So again, if I were a political strategist, if I were advising the campaigns, this would be an encouraging number for Democrats and a discouraging one for Republicans. And asking yourself, who's going to vote? How are they going to likely vote when they get into the voting booth? The fact that a majority of the electorate disapproves of the president suggests that the Republican Party is in some trouble in this election. Notice also, if you look at these probably voters, right? Same kind of pattern, right? So if you can shift people from the probably column into the definitely column, you're likely to get somebody who disapproves of the president being added to the electorate. How about that political activity by Trump approval? I thought this was telling as well. The people who are most politically active are people who disapprove of the president. They're more likely to contact their officials, go to a protest, give money, help someone register to vote. So the picture that the poll paints then is one of an electorate where views of the president are having a lot of influence, and particularly those who disapprove of the president right now appear to be pretty energized heading into election day. Well, how are people going to vote? So this is interesting. I just told you that people like Nate Silver, 538, calculate that Democrats would need to win somewhere between 5 to 7% of the popular vote in the House to capture the House of Representatives. We have the Democratic lead at 3%, with 9% undecided. If Democrats win the popular vote by 3%, Republicans almost certainly hold the House. Now, we're an outlier. So when our poll came out, that number ranged from, I think, 2% to 14%. Polls get really wide variation in this question. And the reason is it's a hard question. Because the actual question that's being asked here is, we say to the respondent, are you more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate for House in the 2018 midterms? Well, you can see the problems here. We're not asking about the actual candidate, right? We don't know whether there's an incumbent up or not, an open seat or not. And so there's, I think, a lot of error in this question. And I think that's one reason why you see results tend to move around. So it's not a perfect question, but it's one of the better ones we have to try and predict what the electorate is going to do heading into the congressional midterm election. And again, we've got 9% undecided here. Now, here are voting intentions for the House by Trump approval. Again, how is the president shaping the electorate? Well, I don't think you'll be surprised to see this. Folks who approve of the president are almost entirely voting Republican. The disapproved folks are voting Democratic. Now, that's noteworthy because remember that independents disproportionately, or rather the plurality of independents disapprove of the president. So that suggests that a lot of those independent votes right now are going to Democratic congressional candidates. It also suggests that, as I say in the slide here, voters are approaching the 2018 midterms as really a referendum on the president. And I think he's trying to make it that. Right? I think the president's strategy has been, he makes this appeal directly in his rallies to voters. You know, if you want to support me, go vote for this Republican candidate. This is about my record. I think voters are not only are approaching the election with that in mind, but the president is framing the election as such for him. But what about immigration? Now, I forgot to show you a YouTube video, so I'll show that to you now. We know that this has become an important factor in our politics, and I'll just show you a little bit of evidence of that. If I can find my YouTube screen here. All right, we're just going to watch this a clip from the president at a recent rally talking about immigration to those in attendance.
So the Democrats want open borders. Let everybody come in. Let everybody pour in. We don't care. Let them come in from the Middle East. Let them come in from all over the place. We don't care. We're not going to let it happen. And by the way, today I signed an executive order. We're going to keep families together, but the border is going to be just as tough as it's been. Democrats don't care about the impact of uncontrolled migration on your communities, your schools, your hospitals, your jobs, or your safety. Democrats put illegal immigrants before they put American citizens. What the hell is going on? Illegal immigration costs our country hundreds of billions of dollars. So imagine if we could spend that money to help bring opportunity to our inner cities and our rural communities and our roads and our highways and our schools. So we've already started the wall. We got 1.6 billion. The wall has been started. San Diego and lots of different places. And we go, but boy, it's tough. They want to do anything they can to obstruct and to make sure it doesn't happen, but it's happening.
Pause there. All right, so this has been a reoccurring theme we've been hearing from the president, talking a lot about illegal immigration to the United States, particularly making the allegation that undocumented immigrants commit more crime than native-born citizens, and that undocumented immigrants propose a threat that needs to be responded to. So we asked about these issues in the Grinnell College National Poll, and our findings, I think, here were quite interesting. First, we found that the public is far more accepting of immigration overall than the media accounts that we've been seeing would suggest. Now, there I'm talking specifically about legal immigration to the United States, following the correct legal procedures to enter the country. But even this allegation that undocumented immigrants commit more crime than native-born citizens has limited resonance. Right? It's appealing to a slice of the electorate, and it's effective, but its appeal is constrained. So let me tell you why I'm making that case. First, we can look at views about immigration by party. Now, we asked a set of questions, and the first three questions are about legal immigration to the United States. First, we asked people, do you think there are too many immigrants in the United States? Second, are immigrants taking jobs from native-born American citizens? Third, do immigrants use welfare more or disproportionately relative to native-born citizens? And then finally, this is related to undocumented immigrants only. Do undocumented immigrants commit more crime than native-born citizens? These numbers are extraordinarily low. Right? Just over 20% of Republicans say there's too many immigrants. Under 20 say they take jobs from native-born citizens. Only about a third say they use welfare disproportionately. And just over half say that undocumented immigrants commit crime at higher levels than native-born citizens. Now, given how much the president has talked about this issue, I was very surprised that that number wasn't higher. It's only about half the party that is in agreement with the president's argument on this issue. Among Democrats, it's low across the board. Among independents, just a bit higher. But still, we looked at these findings, and our reading was there is robust support for legal immigration to the United States. And even this question, this allegation that's being made that undocumented immigrants commit more crime, right, that is only accepted by a pretty small slice of the electorate. It's not a view embraced by Democrats or independents, and only about half the Republican Party embraces that view. So the next thing I did is I conducted a statistical analysis. Now, this is a form of analysis called a linear regression, and what it allows me to do is to test the effect of many variables simultaneously. So, for example, I can, whatever I'm trying to understand, does someone support the president for re-election? I can see simultaneously the effect of age and ideology and political party and gender on that decision and see which one of those variables really matters. So in this case, I tested what factors were most important to support for re-electing the president. I tested the effect of age, ideology, education, religiosity, income, race, political party, gender, nativism, and views toward crime committed by undocumented immigrants. Only a few factors were statistically significant, meaning powerfully associated with support for the president's re-election. And one of them was the respondents' view on whether or not undocumented immigrants commit higher levels of crime. People who believe that were very strongly, or very statistically likely to support re-electing the president. In addition, someone's ideology mattered, how liberal or conservative they are, their race, their party, and their gender. Now, what struck me about that is what didn't show up on the list. Someone's level of education, someone's age. Those are normally powerful predictors of someone's political choice, but now we have someone's view on crime committed by undocumented immigrants making that list. My takeaway point was that this slice of the electorate who has embraced the view that undocumented immigrants commit higher levels of crime is energized. They're mobilized. It is not a majority of people, but it is a strongly held view and one that is shaping their choice to vote. So when the president stands at a rally and makes the kind of arguments that you just heard, I think they're effective. They are effective at rallying certainly the Republican base, a key segment of Republican voters, and that's why he's continuing to do it. Think about the general strategy in this midterm election. It's not persuasion, it's mobilization. Right? And so the president's strategy is to get people to vote, and his strategy to do that is by this very heated rhetoric about fears of crime committed by undocumented immigrants. I also tested the same thing on this question about how people intend to vote in the midterm elections. The first question I showed you was whether you support the president's re-election, and I saw a very similar pattern. Views on crime committed by undocumented immigrants powerfully predicted someone's support for the Republican Party in the midterm elections. So what are the takeaways here? Well, on the one hand, we're not talking about a very big part of the American electorate. It's about half the Republican Party. And it's not a view that's adopted by Democrats or independents. And honestly, it has very little to do with legal immigration. We see strong support for legal immigration to the United States in all the parties. In that respect, this talk you've heard from the administration, these rumors that they want to restrict legal immigration, that's really out of step with where the voters are. But that notwithstanding, these views on undocumented crime committed by undocumented immigrants, that is a powerful mobilizing tool for the Republican base. And it's more predictive than major factors like education or age. And I think that explains the strategy we're seeing. All right, we have a few minutes left here, and so I want to spend my last bit of time talking about the political mobilization of women, and then we can take some questions. So we've seen a tremendous amount of focus from the media on the political mobilization of women. The Women's March that happened at the beginning of the administration. We've just been through the Kavanaugh hearings. What do we observe in our data? Well, this was quite interesting to me. If I have ever gone into an analysis expecting to see a certain result, this was it. I was certain I would see differences in political participation by gender, and I could not find them. It was not present in our data. I think a good lesson for being a social scientist about your assumptions, right? You have to be guided by what you find in the data, and not by your impressions. Now, other data may show something else, but I'll tell you what we found. I looked at this every which way. right? And in this case, we're looking at political activity by men and women by party. And we just did not see major differences by gender, except perhaps among independents. But even this doesn't hold up under statistical analysis.
This is before this week's Kavanaugh hearings.
Our poll was in the field over Labor Day weekend, so this predates Kavanaugh. So we were about to write our second questionnaire. I think we're going to replicate this and see what we find. It'd be very interesting if we could see that the Kavanaugh hearings had a mobilizing effect that was then felt in the midterms. So I analyzed each form of political activity individually. Again, those forms of activity are attending a rally or a protest, giving money, contacting an elected official, helping someone to vote. And in none of those analyses was gender statistically significant, meaning that whether or not someone was a man or a woman was not predictive of whether or not they were more likely to engage in that activity. Here's what did matter: ideology, income, and education. Politically active people were liberal, educated, and disproportionately wealthy. Those were the three things that appeared in our analysis. There was not a statistically significant difference between men and women. So what are the takeaway points from that? Well, I'm really still puzzling my way through this. And, one of the fun aspects of this project is that several faculty members are going to team up with students to write analyses of this data. And so I'm working with a Grinnell College student right now, and we're going to post a blog post analyzing the effect of gender on the midterms. And so we're going to be talking this over and trying to decide what we think is going on. Keep in mind that, again, women are more likely to be Democrats, and so that higher level of activism you may see among women may also reflect party affiliation. Right? But we just haven't gotten to the point in our data where we can really say for certain what's happening. What I can tell you is we're not seeing major differences by gender. So this slide just tells you I looked at that for both the president's reelection. Let me double check that. No, this was looking at each form of political activity individually, and then the effect of gender on voting in the midterm election. Again, gender did not help us sort out people's voting intentions in the midterms. So I think it's worth replicating this again to see if we do see a difference now post-Kavanaugh when we run this survey again after the midterms, but that's where we stand right now. So I think I'll just wrap up then and take some questions from you. So what are some of the broad conclusions, some takeaway points for today? Again, that big point. Elections today are about mobilization and not persuasion. And that's because our electorate has sorted out along ideological lines and geographical lines. It is very, very hard for Democrats to win the House, both because of the small number of competitive seats and because Democrats are so concentrated in urban areas that you have to have really enormous Democratic turnout for them to take the House. Finally, I think as we look on the Republican side, this intense schedule of rallies that the president is maintaining, he's got them going almost all the time, that is all about mobilizing the Republican electorate, trying to make sure Republicans vote, and he's doing it by talking about issues that he knows rouses the Republican base, particularly immigration. But we have to ask, I think this is a really interesting question to think about as we close, what's the long-term impact of that going to be? You know, is Donald Trump another Pete Wilson who might be able to ride anti-immigration sentiment for another election victory, but ultimately lead to the long-term decline of the Republican Party as happened in California as that demographic change takes hold? Or will another pattern emerge? Because of the distribution of the population around the United States, doesn't mirror the way California's population is distributed. So we're at a turning point here. Clearly, immigration is a powerful issue in the electorate, dividing the electorate, but we don't know which of these directions we may go. So let me stop there, and we can take some questions before we wrap up.
Did the Grinnell poll deal with?
Tommy, can I hold just a minute? I'm going to ask people to speak.
Sure.
Thank you.
I was wondering if the poll in any way determined age.
The age of the respondent?
Yeah.
We did ask their age.
Okay.
Yep, and we control for that, and in all the analyses I showed you, I control for that.
Peter, I'm really asking about something you showed us, but I want to be sure that the poll does not show any deviation from the pattern of turnout over past elections. In other words, it doesn't look as though the turnout will be any greater this time than in previous elections, despite the mobilization efforts, or?
Well, I should say, if you look at the people who say they're definitely going to turn out, that number is really high. 86% of Republicans and 70% of Democrats. I frankly don't believe that. Real turnout numbers are much lower than that. So people aren't giving us fully accurate answers here. But that's our best. So political scientists always try and model what the likely electorate is going to look like. And there are various ways of doing that. Ann Seltzer doesn't believe in that. She just takes, goes with what people tell us, and we present it. And so the real numbers will be below what we show here.
In talking about the reasons why Democrats are at a disadvantage in gaining a majority in the House compared to Republicans, you didn't say anything about, I believe it's a legal demand, that states must draw districts with an African American majority so as to make sure that Congress has African Americans, so that the Congress looks more like the country. It takes about a 60 to 70% African American majority in a district to accomplish that. The result is you get contorted, gerrymandered districts. There was one in North Carolina that ran from inner city Greensboro down I-85 to inner city Charlotte. Well, what is left over? Republicans. Am I not right about that? And isn't that a factor in explaining why it's harder for Democrats? It's only one factor, but it seems to me it's an important factor.
Right, so the creation of a majority-minority district like that, which is a district where you concentrate minority voters in order to allow them to elect a representative of their choice, it groups together Democratic voters in much the way that a city does. Right? And so you have large concentrations of Democratic voters, and those voters win that district easily. But again, if you were a master strategist trying to figure out how to allocate Democratic voters, you would want them more evenly sprinkled out in many districts so that there were more competitive districts. And both urbanization and majority-minority districts contribute to the concentration of Democratic voters.
I'm curious about the process you used for the surveys and whether or not it changed because of how inaccurate the polls were in the last presidential election.
The first thing we did is we hired a very good pollster. So Ann Seltzer has an A+ rating. Her polls are known for being accurate. That said, every poll is a random sample of the US population, and there are a variety of factors that are making it harder to sample the US population. So getting people to answer their cell phones, for example. The New York Times is actually running a really interesting project right now. They are doing live polling of congressional districts. So you can go on their website and you can watch them making calls and reporting in the results. And I have to go look at what the statistic is again, but it seemed to me like they had to make 1,000 calls to get one pickup, something like that. It that number was really high. I don't remember exactly what it was, but you can find it if you go look on the Times website. So I guess there's 2 points I would say. We're trying to work with one of the best pollsters in the country, and that there are natural sources of error that are very hard to address. But our basic method is simple. This is a simple random sample of the American population based on a live interviewer calling someone on their landline or cell phone and talking to them.
Peter, thank you so much. It was so interesting.